Okay, so now we have the three broad categories for the movement puzzle. So let's talk about why these are prioritized that way. I think obviously we start with that skill set. If we have bad skill, I mean, it's possible to have someone that's really physically talented that can kind of force through a lot of a lot of the solution that they're trying to solve because they're very athletic, but it's not optimal. I mean, even if you take the really physically talented athlete and you give them better skill, they're going to be more effective with that skill. So we have to start with the skill set. There's no real use if you don't have that skill set to go and start breaking down all of these physical attributes because, like I said, without the skill set to start to build on, we don't really know what our weak links are in performing that skill if we don't have this, okay? And then finally, if we don't have this, so even if we do have a good skill set and we do know how to teach or learn how to do that skill, but we're too weak or can't create enough stability to do it or don't have the mobility to do it right, and those physical attributes are not there, there's really no use continuing to do those reps to improve the coordination, because then we have to ask, what are we improving coordination of? We're really talking about, grooving a bad pattern then. So that would be the reason why those three categories are prioritized that way. The second thing we need to talk about if we're talking about quality movement would be the responsibility of the torso or the core. We use the term torso just because a lot of people already have a preconceived idea of what their core is. So basically the torso would be your body minus the arms and the legs. Okay, so it's your entire trunk, your neck, and the head. There are two main jobs of the torso when we're talking about performing a movement. Number one would be to redistribute. Some people call it tension, other people call it force, whatever you want to call it. It's the thing that we're always wanting to control in performance of movement. The second job is going to be redirecting it. And that's that same thing. It's either tension or force. Okay, so let me explain these two things really quick because they sound confusing because of the term, but it's really something that over the years we've kind of really simplified the jobs of the core because we hear all the time, talking to coaches and even the athletes when we're training them, we hear the words, stability and transferring force and all of these things. But when we start to have conversations about it, we realize that there's really a big misunderstanding or misconception with what those words actually mean when it comes to actually using those skills to perform a movement. So redistributing. Let's think of redistributing like this. So if this were the torso, and let's just really simplify this, okay? Let's say there were 4 muscles in this area of the torso, and a certain position or certain movement, let's say that certain position created tension in, say, these 2 muscles of that area, okay? And let's say all 4 of those muscles were meant to be contributors to this tension. The first job of the core in redistributing tension would just mean that we're able to take the tension that this position or the movement creates passively, and we're able to actively redistribute, and it's basically sharing the workload over the other muscles that were designed to also help out with that. So that would be redistributing tension. Redirecting tension is something that I think most people would relate to because it's a concept that we see the core performing, a job that we see the core performing. So let's say we had that same tension and we didn't have the ability to redistribute that tension over the entire area that we're supposed to. And let's say we're dealing with force, say, from the ground. So this would be the leg we're standing on in kicking. And the goal here is to redirect that force from the ground out the other limb. So we're basically kicking. This is the occurrence of kicking in the body. So if we cannot redistribute this, there's no way that we can redirect this force, because what happens in the core, in the trunk, is that when we need to pass tension through or pass force through the trunk, when we have areas of instability that are supposed to be stable, ends up absorbing this force. So it never really, or not, we're not optimally transferring that force out through the other limb.
Before we go on, could you briefly just explain tension or force for like maybe our younger audience that hasn't taken like math or physics in the upper level?
I guess the simplest way would be, and we're going to do this later in the segment, but the simplest thing to relate this to would be, everyone knows, a plank or a bridge, prone bridge. So if you get on the floor, belly down, and you're on your forearms, the goal of that, the goal of this is to hold the body in a tall posture, right? In this position, just by nature of the position, creates tension on the bottom side passively. So the position itself makes Phil tighten up on the bottom side. But he won't passively have tension going all the way around his torso. So the idea of redistributing tension would be to practice taking that tension that's created passively on the front side and making it wrap 360 degrees around the entire trunk. So that would be redistributing. Redirecting, the best way to relate this would be probably as a series of either springs or rods. So if we're going to pass tension or force through an object, we'd probably want to pass it through the solid object, right? The rod, not the spring, because when we pass it through the spring, what we get is a compression force. The spring's just going to compress. So really that's what we know in the body as absorbing. And so it's really hard to transfer force through that, because what we get is a response from the other end, and it ends up with a compression force. So that would be the skill of redirecting. So I guess in the relationship between these two things is important, because if we don't have this, which is really a more fundamental skill, if we don't have that, there's really no reason to be working on this. And the interesting thing about training, and this is for athletes and coaches too, it's really common to see athletes and coaches having their athletes do things that address this skill, but never address this skill. And so even in a lot of athletes that we've tested, we find out that this is where their weak links are. It's not really in the know-how of doing these things. So something like this would be the skill of using the hip to drive from the ground through the kick. And we see people working on that, but oftentimes they're not addressing the more fundamental things.
All right, guys. Thank you for watching.
Whoa, hold on a sec.
Whoa. Well,
All right, go ahead.
nice shirt. Thank you for watching the YUNSHOW.